Montana Territory, 1875. The sky stretched endless and blue above Willow Creek, a vast canvas that seemed to mock Zachary Vaughn as he stared out from his half-built homestead. 26 years old and already widowed, already feeling like the frontier had taken more than it would ever give back. 6 months since typhoid had swept through the settlement and taken Sarah, 6 months of forcing himself to continue with the life they'd planned together. He leaned against the porch railing, his lean frame silhouetted against the setting sun. The cattle lowed in the distance, reminding him of chores yet undone. His once hopeful hazel eyes now carried shadows no young man should know, though his face remained handsome beneath the light stubble he maintained out of habit rather than vanity. "The West doesn't make room for sentiments," he muttered to no one, a mantra he'd adopted since burying his wife. "You survive or you don't, that's all there is." The wind carried his words away as it rustled through the tall grass, seeming to answer with its own whispered contradictions. But Zach had stopped listening to hope months ago. Miles away in that same golden light, a stagecoach rattled toward Willow Creek, its sole passenger clutching a letter of employment to her chest like a talisman. Nora Kingsley, 22 years old and freshly graduated from a teacher's college back east, peered anxiously through the dust-caked window at the wild country rushing past. Her soft brown hair had come loose from its practical bun, curling around her face in defiance of the pins meant to tame it. Her pale blue traveling dress, once crisp and proper, now bore the marks of 3 days' hard travel. "Almost there, miss," the driver called down. "Willow Creek's just beyond that rise." Nora nodded, though he couldn't see her, and straightened her spine. She'd chosen this path, volunteered specifically for a frontier posting when most of her classmates had sought positions in established eastern towns. Something about the wildness, the unbounded possibility of the West had called to her since childhood. "A place to become something more than what others expect," she whispered, touching the locket at her throat, the one containing a miniature portrait of the parents she'd lost to influenza 3 years earlier. "A place to matter." The stagecoach crested the hill, and Willow Creek appeared below. A collection of wooden buildings strung along a dusty main street, surrounded by scattered homesteads that gave way to the vast wilderness beyond. It was smaller than she'd imagined, more fragile-looking against the towering backdrop of distant mountains. For a moment, doubt clouded her bright green eyes. What if this had been a terrible mistake? 2 days later, Zachary led his wagon into town, a monthly ritual he maintained out of necessity rather than desire. Willow Creek's bustling main street meant people, and people meant questions, sympathy, and worst of all, the pitying glances that followed him since Sarah's passing. At 26, he felt decades older, worn down by grief and the relentless demands of maintaining the ranch alone. He tied his horses outside the general store, nodding curtly to familiar faces while avoiding conversation. 6 months and still the town treated him like he might shatter. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps he was just fragments of a man held together by routine and obligation. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," he said to the storekeeper, handing over his list of supplies. "Zachary, good to see you in town." The older man's enthusiasm seemed forced. "Heard we've got ourselves a schoolteacher now." Town council finally finished the schoolhouse last week, and she arrived all the way from Boston 2 days back. Zach grunted noncommittally. The children of Willow Creek deserved education, but news of the settlement's growth held little interest for him. "Mighty pretty young lady, too," Peterson continued, selecting items from the shelves. "Name's Miss Kingsley. Staying with the Reverend and his wife until suitable accommodations can be arranged." "That's so," Zach's flat response discouraged further conversation, and they completed the transaction in blessed silence. As he loaded supplies onto his wagon, a commotion further down the street caught his attention. A crowd had gathered outside the newly constructed schoolhouse, and despite himself, Zach found his gaze drawn to the slender figure at its center. Even from a distance, something about her, perhaps the way she stood, chin lifted slightly as she addressed the assembled parents and children, drew his eye. He looked away quickly, focusing on securing his supplies. Other men might be interested in the town's new addition, but Zachary Vaughn had already loved and lost once on this merciless frontier. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Fate, however, had other plans. The sharp crack of a starting pistol startled one of his horses, sending the normally placid animal rearing in panic. Zach lunged for the reins, but the damage was already done. His wagon lurched sideways, colliding with a water trough and sending a stack of crates tumbling into the street. "Whoa, easy boy," he commanded, finally getting control of the frightened horse. Only then did he survey the mess, flour, coffee, and other supplies scattered across the dusty road. "Are you all right?" A feminine voice, cultured yet warm, came from behind him. Zach turned to find himself looking down into the greenest eyes he'd ever seen. The schoolteacher, it had to be her, stood closer than he'd expected, her expression concerned rather than accusatory. "Fine," he said shortly, immediately bending to retrieve his scattered goods. "Just an accident." Instead of moving on, she knelt beside him, gathering spilled flour with bare hands, heedless of the dust soiling her simple blue dress. "Let me help." "That's not necessary, miss." His tone was harsher than intended. "I'm quite capable," she replied with unexpected firmness, "and it will go faster with two." Up close, her features were even more striking. Not the porcelain doll beauty he might have expected from an Eastern lady, but something more vibrant. Her brown hair caught copper highlights in the sun, and a scattering of freckles dusted a nose that turned up slightly at the end. "Nora Kingsley," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "The new schoolteacher." Zachary Vaughn. He accepted a tin of coffee from her outstretched hand, careful not to touch her fingers. "I ranch north of town." "A cowboy," she said, with a hint of a smile. "I've read about men like you." That pulled a reluctant half-smile from him. "I doubt those books got much right, Miss Kingsley." "Probably not," she agreed, helping him place the last salvageable items in his wagon. "But I've always believed in learning through observation, rather than assumption." Something about her directness, so different from the cautious way most townspeople approached him these days, momentarily penetrated the armor he'd constructed around himself. "Well, you'll get plenty of opportunity to observe out here," he said, more gently. "Willow Creek isn't Boston." "Thank goodness for that," she replied with unexpected feeling. "I didn't come west seeking more of what I left behind." Before he could respond, they were interrupted by the town's mayor, a portly man whose name Zach could never remember. "Miss Kingsley, I see you've met our Mr. Vaughn." The man's eyes darted between them, curiosity poorly disguised as casual interest. "Zachary runs one of the finest cattle operations in the territory, though we don't see him in town as often as we'd like." Nora straightened, brushing flour from her hands. "We were just getting acquainted after a minor mishap." "Indeed, indeed. Actually, Miss Kingsley, I was hoping to introduce you to some of our leading citizens this afternoon. Perhaps you'd join us for tea at Mrs. Hollister's." She nodded graciously, though Zach thought he detected reluctance in the gesture. "Of course, Mayor Collins, I'll be there directly." With the mayor hovering nearby, Zach tipped his hat. "Thank you for your assistance, Miss Kingsley." "Mr. Vaughn," she acknowledged with a slight nod. As he climbed onto his wagon, Zach found himself unexpectedly affected by the brief encounter. It had been months since he'd engaged in conversation with anyone beyond the bare necessities of commerce or ranch business. Months since he'd really looked at another person, especially a woman. The thought troubled him as he guided his team out of town. Sarah had been gone only half a year, and here he was noticing green eyes and freckles. The realization strengthened his resolve. The ranch would be his world, his work his only companion. Anything else invited heartbreak that the harsh reality of frontier life would inevitably deliver. Nora watched the tall cowboy drive away, intrigued despite herself. There was a story there. She could see it in the shadows behind his eyes, in the careful distance he maintained even while accepting her help. "A word of friendly advice, Miss Kingsley," Mayor Collins said, interrupting her thoughts. "Young Vaughn keeps to himself these days. Lost his wife to the fever last winter. They'd only been married a year or so." "Tragic business." "How terrible," she murmured, understanding now the pain she'd glimpsed. Indeed, he was different before, engaged in town affairs, always ready to lend a hand, but grief changes a man. The mayor shook his head. Just thought you should know, since you'll be teaching some of the children from neighboring ranches. The Vaughn place is isolated, but there are several families nearby with school-age youngsters. Nora nodded, absorbing this information while watching the wagon disappear around a bend in the road. 26 and already widowed, no wonder he carried himself as if the weight of the world pressed down upon those broad shoulders. She squared her own shoulders. I should prepare for this afternoon. If you'll excuse me. As she walked back to the modest room she occupied in the Reverend's home, Nora reflected on her first impressions of Willow Creek. The town was smaller than she'd anticipated, the challenges greater, but something about this place, perhaps the very rawness of it, spoke to her soul. Here perhaps she could build something meaningful, could help shape young minds and the community itself. And if she found herself thinking of hazel eyes and a reluctant half-smile as she changed for tea, well, that was merely natural curiosity about a man whose story touched her heart. The coming weeks established rhythms for both Zachary and Nora. For him, the endless cycle of ranch work, moving cattle, mending fences, breaking horses, filled his days from dawn until dusk. For her, the schoolhouse became a kingdom of her own making, where 15 children of varying ages and backgrounds gathered each weekday to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and though the town council hadn't specifically requested it, poetry, natural science, and art. Their paths crossed occasionally in town, leading to brief, polite exchanges that never ventured beyond superficial pleasantries. Yet each carried away impressions of the other, Nora noting how the townspeople respected Zachary despite his reticence, Zachary observing how quickly the young teacher had become a beloved fixture in Willow Creek. As spring ripened toward summer, Willow Creek prepared for its annual Founders' Day celebration. The event had grown from humble beginnings to a 3-day affair that drew people from neighboring settlements for horse races, shooting competitions, dances, and community meals. Miss Kingsley, we were hoping you'd help organize the children's presentations, Mrs. Hollister said during a meeting of the Ladies' Aid Society, which had enthusiastically inducted Nora despite her youth. Perhaps recitations or tableaus, and naturally you'll help judge the pie contest. Nora smiled, touched by their inclusion. I'd be delighted. The children have been practicing their elocution. I think a series of patriotic recitations would be well received. Later that same day, Mayor Collins approached Zachary outside the blacksmith's shop. We need you on the racing committee, Vaughn, he said without preamble. Nobody knows horseflesh like you do, and we're expecting entries from as far as Bitterroot this year. Zach's instinct was to refuse. He'd avoided social gatherings since Sarah's passing, finding the forced gaiety painful. I don't think. It's been 6 months, son, Collins interrupted gently. Sarah wouldn't want you living like a hermit. The mention of his wife's name, spoken aloud by another, hit Zach like a physical blow. He turned away, adjusting the saddle he'd been having repaired. I'll think about it, he said finally, knowing it was easier than arguing. Collins clapped him on the shoulder. Good man, meetings Tuesday at the town hall. 4 o'clock. When Tuesday came, Zach surprised himself by riding into town for the meeting. Perhaps it was time to rejoin the living, at least in some small way. Sarah had loved Founders' Day, her joy in the simple celebration one of many things he'd cherished about her. The town hall, a grand name for what was essentially a large meeting room above the general store, was buzzing with activity when he arrived. Various committees worked at different tables, their conversations creating a hum of anticipation. Mayor Collins spotted him immediately. Vaughn, over here. As Zach made his way across the room, he noticed Miss Kingsley seated with several women, her brown head bent over what appeared to be a list. She looked up as he passed, offering a smile that contained neither pity nor excessive brightness, just simple acknowledgement. He nodded in return, oddly comforted by her straightforward manner. The racing committee welcomed him with enthusiasm that bordered on relief. We need someone who can spot a ringer, explained old Mr. Fredericks, who'd been organizing the races for 20 years. Last year that fellow from Helena entered a thoroughbred in the quarter-mile and claimed it was just a particularly fast cow pony. Nearly caused a riot when he took the prize money. Despite himself, Zach found the work engaging. He'd always had an eye for horses, and the technical aspects of organizing fair and entertaining races absorbed him completely, until a commotion at the ladies' table drew everyone's attention. "It simply won't do, Mrs. Hollister was saying, her voice carrying across the room. "We cannot possibly host the dance without proper decorations, and if the bunting hasn't arrived." "Perhaps we could create alternatives," Miss Kingsley suggested, her calm voice a counterpoint to the older woman's agitation. "I've seen lovely decorations made from paper flowers and—" "Paper flowers," Mrs. Hollister looked scandalized. "For Founders' Day, what would people think?" Mayor Collins intervened. Ladies, what seems to be the problem?" As Mrs. Hollister explained about delayed shipments and decorating disasters, Zach found himself watching Miss Kingsley. Unlike many of the women, who seemed genuinely distressed by the bunting crisis, she appeared more amused than concerned. When she caught him looking, she raised an eyebrow in a gesture that somehow conveyed both commiseration and humor. He looked away quickly, but the moment stayed with him, that brief, wordless communication across a crowded room. The meeting concluded with promises from Mayor Collins to telegraph about the missing decorations, and assignments distributed to the various committees. As people began to disperse, Zach found himself walking out behind Miss Kingsley. "Sounds like Founders' Day might be less festive than planned," he commented, surprising himself by initiating conversation. She glanced up at him, amusement dancing in her eyes. "A tragedy of epic proportions. However will we celebrate the founding of Willow Creek without the traditional red, white, and blue bunting?" Her gentle mockery of the situation drew an unexpected laugh from him, the first genuine laugh he could remember in months. "Shocking disrespect from our schoolteacher." "Not at all," she countered, descending the stairs beside him. "I take my responsibilities very seriously, Mr. Vaughn, which is precisely why I've already decided to teach the children to make paper flowers tomorrow. By Friday, we'll have enough to decorate the entire town hall, bunting or no bunting." Resourceful, he acknowledged. They reached the bottom of the stairs, pausing in the late afternoon sunlight. She was smaller than he'd realized, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. "Necessity breeds invention on the frontier, or so I'm learning," she said, "though I imagine you could teach me far more about frontier adaptability than I could learn in a dozen committee meetings." It was an opening, he realized, an invitation to further conversation. And for a brief moment, he considered accepting it. There was something about her direct gaze and intelligent observations that made him want to respond in kind. Instead, he retreated to safety. "You seem to be adapting well enough, Miss Kingsley. If you'll excuse me, I should be getting back to the ranch before dark." Something like disappointment flickered across her face, quickly masked. "Of course, good evening, Mr. Vaughn." As he rode home, Zach found himself replaying that brief exchange, wondering why he felt both relieved and regretful at having ended it so abruptly. It had been pleasant, that moment of shared amusement, a connection, however fleeting. But connections led to attachments, and attachments to loss. The West had taught him that lesson all too clearly. The schoolhouse filled with laughter and the rustle of paper as Nora guided her students through the creation of elaborate paper flowers. "Remember, children, these will represent our town to visitors from all around. Let's make them as beautiful as possible." Jenny Miller, 10 years old and earnest, looked up from a somewhat lopsided rose. "Miss Kingsley, is it true that Mr. Vaughn is helping with the horse races this year?" The question caught Nora off guard. "I believe so, yes. Why do you ask?" The little girl shrugged. "Pa says it's good to see him coming around again, says he's been like a ghost since Mrs. Vaughn died." "Jenny," Nora admonished gently, "it isn't polite to discuss such personal matters." "But I didn't know her," the child persisted. "We only moved here in March. Was she nice?" Several of the older children exchanged glances, and Nora realized this was an opportunity to guide them toward empathy rather than gossip. "I didn't know Mrs. Vaughn either," she said carefully, "but I understand she was very much loved and that many people miss her. When someone we care about dies, it causes great pain, and everyone handles that pain differently. Some people need more time alone with their grief. "Is that why Mr. Vaughn doesn't come to church anymore?" asked Billy Thompson, at 12 the oldest boy in the school. Nora considered her response. "I couldn't say, Billy. But I do know that judging others, when we haven't experienced their particular sorrow, isn't our place." The children nodded solemnly, and Nora redirected their attention to the paper flowers. Yet the conversation lingered in her mind. In her 3 months in Willow Creek, she compiled a patchwork understanding of Zachary Vaughn from brief encounters and town gossip. A promising young rancher who'd brought his bride to the territory with dreams of building a cattle empire, only to lose her before their first anniversary. It explained the shadows in his eyes, the careful distance he maintained. Yet occasionally she glimpsed something else, like that moment of shared humor at the committee meeting, suggesting the man he might have been before grief reshaped him. Founders' Day arrived with perfect weather and excitement that seemed to vibrate through the town. The main street had been transformed with banners, booths, and yes, paper flowers created by Nora's students, which proved so charming that Mrs. Hollister declared them a delightful frontier innovation rather than a poor substitute for proper bunting. The morning began with children's recitations in the town square, followed by a community picnic. Afternoon would bring the races and shooting competitions, with the grand dance scheduled for evening. Nora wore her best dress, a forest green cotton with ivory lace trim that complemented her eyes. As she supervised her students' performances, she couldn't help noticing Zachary Vaughn among the spectators. He stood slightly apart, as was his habit, but his presence at all represented a concession to community life that seemed significant. When the recitations concluded to enthusiastic applause, Nora released her students to their parents and found herself momentarily alone as the crowd dispersed toward the picnic grounds. "Your students did well," came a now familiar voice from behind her. She turned to find Zachary standing closer than she'd expected, looking more approachable than usual in a clean white shirt and dark vest. Without the customary shadows of exhaustion, his features revealed a handsome young man rather than the careworn rancher she'd come to know. "Thank you," she replied, pleased by the compliment. They worked very hard. An awkward silence fell between them, neither quite sure how to proceed beyond the initial exchange. Finally, Zachary gestured toward the distant picnic grounds. "I should check on the race preparations." Disappointment flickered through her, though she masked it with a polite nod. "Of course, I'm sure it will be an exciting afternoon." He hesitated, seeming on the verge of saying something more, then simply tipped his hat and walked away. Nora sighed, gathering her notes from the recitations. She'd been in Willow Creek long enough to make several friends among the townspeople, yet found herself inexplicably drawn to its most reserved resident. Perhaps it was the teacher in her, always looking for the story beneath the surface, or perhaps, "Miss Kingsley," Mayor Collins interrupted her thoughts. "The picnic committee is looking for you, something about judging the pies." She smiled, pushing thoughts of Zachary Vaughn aside. Today was for celebrating with her new community, not puzzling over enigmatic cowboys. The afternoon races drew everyone in town to the flat stretch of prairie that served as Willow Creek's track. Temporary stands had been erected for spectators, while competitors prepared their horses at the far end of the course. Zachary moved among the entries with professional focus, examining each horse to ensure it was entered in the appropriate category. He just finished inspecting a sturdy paint entered in the barrel race when a commotion near the registration table caught his attention. "What do you mean he can't enter?" An angry voice rose above the general hubbub. "My boy's been practicing for weeks." Zach approached to find a red-faced man confronting Mayor Collins. Beside him stood a boy of about 13, clutching the reins of a spirited chestnut horse that seemed too much for his slight frame to handle. "Mr. Porter, please understand," Collins was saying, "the youth race is for children under 12. Timothy is too old to compete in that category, and the open race isn't appropriate for. So he doesn't get to race at all after all his preparation." Porter's voice rose dangerously. Zach stepped in. "What's the issue here?" Both men turned to him, Collins with relief, Porter with continued belligerence. "This bureaucrat is telling my boy he can't race," Porter spat. "Says he's too old for the children's race and won't let him in the open competition." Zach assessed the situation quickly. The boy, Timothy, looked both embarrassed by his father's outburst and desperately eager to prove himself. The horse, a quality animal but high-strung, pawed the ground nervously. "The age limits were published in advance," Zach said calmly to Porter, "and the open race includes experienced riders from 3 counties. It wouldn't be safe." "Are you saying my boy can't handle himself?" Porter demanded, stepping closer in challenge. Before Zach could respond, a feminine voice intervened. "Perhaps there's another solution." They all turned to find Miss Kingsley approaching, looking cool and composed despite the tension. Her green dress caught the sunlight, matching her eyes in a way Zach couldn't help but notice. "Miss Kingsley, this is hardly," Collins began. "What if," she continued smoothly, "we added an exhibition race for young riders aged 12 to 16, not part of the official competition this year, but potentially for next year if there's interest." The suggestion hung in the air for a moment. Porter looked slightly mollified, while his son's face lit with hope. "We'd need more than one rider," Zach pointed out, finding himself unexpectedly aligned with her intervention. "The Johnson boy is 14 and brought his pony," Collins said slowly, warming to the idea. "And I believe the Henderson's daughter is 13. Within minutes, Miss Kingsley's impromptu solution had gained momentum. 4 eligible riders were identified, a shortened course established, and an exhibition race added to the program, with Zachary designated to supervise for safety. As the details were finalized and Porter led his much happier son away to prepare, Zach found himself standing alone with Miss Kingsley. "Thank you," he said simply. "That could have turned ugly." She shrugged, a surprisingly informal gesture for such a composed young woman. It seemed a shame for the boy to be disappointed when a compromise was possible. "Besides, I've watched Timothy with the younger children at school. He's responsible and kind. He deserves a chance to prove himself." Her understanding of the boy's character impressed Zach. "You pay close attention to your students." "Of course, don't you pay attention to each of your cattle, Mr. Vaughn? Know their temperaments and tendencies." The comparison startled him into a smile. Hardly the same thing. "Isn't it? Both require observation, patience, and individualized approaches." Her eyes twinkled with mischief. "Though I'll admit, I've never had to lasso a student who wandered off from the herd." That drew a genuine laugh from him. "The term's not over yet, Miss Kingsley. Give it time." Their shared laughter felt unexpectedly good, natural in a way few things had since Sarah's death. For a moment, Zach allowed himself to simply enjoy the connection, the easy give and take of their conversation. "I should help organize this new race," he said finally, reluctant but aware of his responsibilities. "And I promise to help serve lemonade between events," she replied. "Perhaps I'll see you later at the dance." The question held no pressure, just a gentle openness that left him room to retreat if needed. Something in her understanding loosened a knot in his chest. "Perhaps," he answered, neither committing nor refusing. "Good day, Miss Kingsley." As the afternoon progressed, Zachary found himself watching for glimpses of a green dress among the crowd. The exhibition race proved a success, with Timothy Porter taking second place to the Henderson girls' expert riding, a result that satisfied both the boy's pride and his father's ambitions. The open races followed, with excitement building as local favorites competed against riders from neighboring settlements. Throughout it all, Zach performed his duties while increasingly aware that something had shifted within him. For the first time in months, he felt fully present, engaged with the community around him rather than merely going through the motions of participation. As twilight approached and the racing concluded, people began drifting toward the town hall for the evening dance. Zach hesitated, his instinct to return to the ranch warring with an unexpected desire to see the evening through, to perhaps share another conversation with a certain green-eyed schoolteacher. "Heading home, Vaughn," called Mr. Fredericks as they finished storing the racing equipment. Zach made a decision that surprised even himself. Actually, I thought I might stop by the dance for a while. The older man's eyebrows shot up, but he merely nodded. Good. About time. The town hall had been transformed by lantern light and the paper flowers Nora's students had created. Musicians tuned their instruments on a small platform at one end, while long tables laden with refreshments lined the other. Already the room buzzed with conversation and laughter as people celebrated the successful day. Zach entered quietly, immediately feeling conspicuous despite the crowded room. He hadn't attended a social function since the Christmas gathering where Sarah had first shown symptoms of what they'd initially mistaken for a winter chill. Zachary. You came, Mrs. Hollister descended upon him with motherly enthusiasm, and just in time, we're about to begin the first dance. Before he could formulate a polite escape, he spotted Miss Kingsley across the room, deep in conversation with Reverend Thomas. The lantern light caught her profile, illuminating the animated expression that seemed to be her natural state when engaged in discussion. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, their eyes meeting across the crowded room. A smile of genuine pleasure brightened her face at the sight of him, not the careful, pitying smiles he'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer, more real. He nodded in acknowledgement, finding himself moving in her direction before he'd consciously decided to do so. Mr. Vaughn, she greeted him as he approached, how wonderful to see you here. Miss Kingsley, he inclined his head slightly, Reverend. Zachary, my boy, excellent job with the races today, the Reverend said warmly. I hear we have Miss Kingsley to thank for averting disaster with young Timothy Porter. It was a simple solution, she demurred. Sometimes those are the best kind, Zach found himself saying. The musicians struck up a lively tune, and couples began moving to the center of the room. Reverend Thomas excused himself to find his wife, leaving Zachary and Nora momentarily alone despite the crowd surrounding them. Do you dance, Mr. Vaughn? She asked after a brief silence. The question should have sent him retreating. Dancing meant touching, closeness, things he'd avoided since Sarah's death, yet somehow the prospect didn't fill him with the usual dread. I used to, he admitted. She studied him with those perceptive green eyes. Used to suggest you've forgotten how. I doubt that's possible. Miss Kingsley, he began, not sure whether he was about to accept or refuse. Nora, she interrupted gently. After collaborating on frontier crisis management and race organization, I think we've earned first-name basis, don't you? Her directness disarmed him once again. Zachary, then. Or Zach to most people. Zach, she repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Now that we've established that, would you like to dance, or would you prefer to continue our conversation somewhere quieter? The choice is entirely yours. The absence of pressure in her offer touched him deeply. She was giving him space to choose his own comfort level, with no expectation beyond the moment they shared. I think, he said slowly, that I remember how to dance after all. Her smile was like sunrise. Excellent. I should warn you, though, I attended a very proper Eastern finishing school where dancing was considered an essential accomplishment. I may outshine you completely. The teasing challenge in her voice drew an answering smile from him. We'll see about that, Boston. He offered his arm, and she placed her hand lightly upon it, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor. As the music swelled around them, Zachary felt something long dormant stir within his heart, not replacing what he had lost but existing alongside it. A reminder that he was still alive, still capable of connection. For the first time in 6 months, the thought didn't feel like betrayal. The night air carried the scent of pine and sage as Nora stepped outside the town hall, grateful for the momentary respite from the warm, crowded dance floor. The stars shone with astonishing brightness above Willow Creek, more numerous than she'd ever seen back east. Quite a sight, isn't it? She turned to find Zachary approaching, 2 cups of punch in hand. He offered one to her, which she accepted gratefully. Thank you, and yes, the stars here are magnificent, she replied. In Boston, the city lights and buildings obscure all but the brightest. He leaned against the porch railing beside her, close but not crowding. One advantage of frontier living, unobstructed views. They sipped their punch in comfortable silence, the music and laughter from inside creating a pleasant backdrop to the night's tranquility. Nora stole a glance at her companion, struck by the transformation a few hours had wrought. The reserved, almost forbidding man she'd first encountered had gradually given way to someone more approachable, still quiet, but with an underlying warmth that emerged when his guard lowered. "Thank you for the dances," she said finally. "You're quite accomplished for a cowboy." His lips quirked in that half-smile she found increasingly appealing. "My mother insisted, said no son of hers would clod around a dance floor like a bear with sore feet, regardless of where we lived." "A wise woman," Nora laughed. "And where was that? You've never mentioned where you're from originally." "Virginia originally. My parents moved west after the war. My father wanted a fresh start away from the devastation." A shadow crossed his face. "They're both gone now. Influenza 4 years ago." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "My parents died of the same 3 years back. It's partly why I came west, too many ghosts in Boston." Their shared loss created a bridge between them, an understanding that needed no further explanation. "And now here you are, teaching frontier children to recite Longfellow and make paper flowers," he observed. "And enjoying every minute," she confirmed. "Though I admit, it's not exactly what I expected when I accepted the position." "How so?" She considered the question. "I thought I'd be bringing civilization to the wilderness, enlightening minds starved for knowledge, very noble, very self-important." Her self-deprecating tone made him chuckle. "Instead, I'm learning at least as much as I'm teaching. These children already know things I never will about survival, nature, practical skills. I'm just adding book learning to their existing wisdom." "You're good with them," he said, surprising her with the observation. "I watched during the recitations. They respect you." High praise indeed, coming from a man who can make a 1,000-pound animal follow his lead. "Cattle are simpler than children. They only want 3 things: food, water, and no predators. Whereas children want approval, challenge, security, understanding, adventure, boundaries." She began ticking points off on her fingers. "All right, you've made your point," he conceded with a smile. From inside came the opening notes of a waltz, slower and more intimate than the earlier dances. Something shifted in the air between them, a awareness of possibilities neither had acknowledged. "Would you," he began, just as she said, "perhaps we should." They both stopped, then laughed at the simultaneous interruption. "After you," Nora offered. Zachary hesitated, then extended his hand. "Would you care to dance again, Nora? This one's a waltz." The sound of her name on his lips sent a pleasant warmth through her chest. "I'd like that very much, Zach." As they returned inside, Nora knew something significant had happened on that starlit porch. A connection formed that went beyond mere acquaintance or even friendship. She'd come to the West seeking purpose and a fresh start, never expecting to find herself drawn to a man whose heart had been broken by the very land she now called home. The waltz drew them closer than the earlier dances had required, his hand resting lightly at her waist, hers on his shoulder. They moved together with surprising ease, as if they'd been dancing partners for years rather than hours. "You're thinking very loudly," he murmured, amusement in his voice. She looked up, startled. "Am I?" "Your expressions are rather transparent, at least to someone paying attention." The admission that he had been paying attention sent a flutter through her chest. A dangerous quality in a teacher. "The children probably read me like a book." "What were you thinking about just now?" he asked, guiding her smoothly through a turn. Truth rose to her lips before she could consider diplomacy. "That this evening has been unexpected." "In the best possible way." His eyes, hazel with flecks of gold in the lantern light, held hers for a long moment. "Yes," he agreed simply, "it has." As the music drew to a close, neither moved immediately to break apart. For a suspended moment, Nora could almost imagine leaning closer, closing the distance between them. "Miss Kingsley," Mayor Collins's voice shattered the moment. "There you are, Mrs. Hollister was hoping you'd help organize the final group dance before the evening ends." Reality reasserted itself as they stepped apart. Nora summoned a polite smile for the mayor while acutely aware of Zachary's presence beside her. "Of course, Mayor Collins, I'd be happy to help." As she moved away to assist with the closing festivities, Nora felt Zachary's eyes following her. Something had begun between them tonight, something fragile and unspoken, yet undeniably real. Whether it would survive beyond this enchanted evening remained to be seen. The Founders' Day celebration marked a turning point in Willow Creek's perception of both the young schoolteacher and the widowed rancher. Where before they had been seen as separate entities, she the enthusiastic newcomer bringing Eastern refinement to the frontier, he the tragic figure haunting the edges of community life, they were now linked in the town's collective consciousness. Not as a couple precisely, but as two young people who might, under the right circumstances, become one. For Zachary, the days following the dance brought confusion and guilt in equal measure. He found himself thinking of Nora at unexpected moments, remembering the warmth of her hand in his, the intelligent spark in her green eyes, the way her laughter seemed to bypass his defenses. These thoughts inevitably led to memories of Sarah, followed by crushing guilt at the apparent betrayal. Yet when Reverend Thomas stopped by the ranch the following Sunday, ostensibly to deliver church bulletins Zach had missed by not attending services, but transparently checking on his welfare, the older man offered unexpected perspective. Sarah was a beautiful soul, the Reverend said as they sat on Zach's porch, coffee mugs in hand. Full of life and love, I believe she would want the same for you, son. Zach stared out at the rolling grassland surrounding his homestead. It's been barely 6 months. Grief doesn't operate on a timetable, Thomas replied gently. Neither does healing or connection with another person. The words settled into Zach's consciousness, not erasing his conflict, but offering a framework for understanding it. Sarah had been vibrant, joyful, always encouraging others to embrace life fully. Would she have wanted him to retreat permanently from human connection? For Nora, the week following Founders' Day brought unexpected developments of a different sort. Monday morning found her schoolhouse unusually full, with several new faces among the students. Timothy Porter, she greeted the boy from the exhibition race with surprise. "I didn't realize you were joining us." The 13-year-old shuffled his feet awkwardly. "Pa said since you stood up for me at the races, maybe your schooling was worth something after all." Nora hid her amusement at this backhanded compliment. "Well, we're delighted to have you. Please take a seat with the older students." Timothy wasn't the only new addition. 3 children from outlying ranches had also appeared, their parents having previously considered the journey too arduous for regular attendance. Now, mysteriously, they had arranged a rotation of transportation that made daily school possible. By Wednesday, Nora suspected these changes weren't coincidental. Her suspicions were confirmed when Mrs. Miller lingered after collecting Jenny from school. "We're all so pleased about you and Mr. Vaughn," the woman said with meaningful emphasis. Nora blinked in confusion. "I'm not sure I understand." "Oh, we don't expect any announcements yet," Mrs. Miller assured her with a knowing smile. "But the way you two danced together at Founders' Day, well, and then him speaking up for your school at the general store the very next day." "Mr. Vaughn spoke about the school," Nora interrupted, genuinely puzzled. "When the Henderson brothers were saying book learning wasn't worth the time for ranch children," Mrs. Miller explained. "Mr. Vaughn told them flat out that education was essential in the changing West, and that Willow Creek was fortunate to have a teacher of your caliber. Quite forceful about it by all accounts." The information left Nora momentarily speechless. She hadn't seen Zachary since the dance, and certainly hadn't expected him to defend her teaching to others. "Mrs. Miller, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she managed finally. "Mr. Vaughn and I are merely acquaintances who happen to dance together at a community event." The older woman's expression turned indulgent. "Of course, dear, very proper of you to say so," she patted Nora's hand. "Anyway, we're all just happy to see him rejoining life a bit. Sarah was such a dear girl, but 6 months is a decent mourning period for a young man with his life ahead of him." As Mrs. Miller departed, leaving Nora standing in the empty schoolhouse. She realized the town had constructed a narrative around her and Zachary that existed almost entirely in their collective imagination. They had taken a few dances, a moment of connection, and built from it a romance that satisfied their desire for a neat resolution to Zachary's period of grief. The situation would have been merely amusing if Nora hadn't recognized her own dangerous susceptibility to that same narrative. The truth was, she had felt something during those dances, something that continued to occupy her thoughts days later. But romantic notions about a man still mourning his wife were foolish at best, potentially harmful at worst. She resolved to maintain a friendly but appropriate distance, allowing time and reality to dispel the town's romantic speculations. Fate, however, had other plans. The last weeks of spring brought heavy rains to the Montana Territory, swelling creeks and rivers beyond their usual boundaries. Willow Creek itself, normally a pleasant, manageable stream running along the town's eastern edge, became a rushing torrent that threatened low-lying properties. Zachary, checking fence lines after a particularly violent storm, found himself near town just as the creek overflowed its banks. The schoolhouse, situated on slightly lower ground than most town buildings, stood directly in the water's path. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse toward town, arriving to find several men already working to divert the flow with hastily constructed barriers. Through the schoolhouse windows, he could see Nora and her students still inside, apparently unaware of the approaching danger. "Miss Kingsley needs to evacuate the children," he called to Mayor Collins, who was directing the flood control efforts. "That water's coming fast." Collins looked up, his face drawn with worry. "We sent Billy Thompson to warn her 10 minutes ago. Hasn't he reached them?" Zachary scanned the area, spotting a small figure struggling against the current some distance away. "Is that him? Looks like he got caught trying to cross where the footbridge used to be." Without waiting for confirmation, Zach urged his horse into the rising water, making his way carefully to where Billy clung to a half-submerged tree. The current pulled strongly at his mount's legs, but the sturdy gelding maintained its footing. "Hold on, Billy," he called as he approached. "I'm coming to get you." The boy looked up, relief washing over his frightened face. "Mr. Vaughn, the bridge washed out when I was halfway across. I couldn't make it to the school." "You're all right now," Zach assured him, maneuvering his horse alongside the tree. "Can you reach up? I'll pull you up behind me." With some effort, he managed to haul the soaking boy onto his horse. "Hold tight to me," he instructed, turning back toward the town side of the creek. Once Billy was safely delivered to the anxious crowd on higher ground, Zach faced a decision. The water was rising rapidly, and the schoolhouse would soon be cut off entirely. "I'm going across," he announced. "They need to evacuate immediately." "Too dangerous," Collins objected. "That current's getting stronger by the minute." Zach's jaw set in determination. All the more reason to get them out now, before it's impossible. Without further debate, he guided his horse back into the swollen creek, choosing a crossing point slightly upstream where the water appeared shallowest. Even so, the current was powerful enough that his horse had to swim briefly in the deepest section, fighting to reach the far bank. By the time they emerged, both horse and rider were soaked, but Zachary wasted no time in galloping the short distance to the schoolhouse. Inside, he found Nora attempting to maintain calm among 15 increasingly frightened children as water began seeping under the door. Her eyes widened at his sudden appearance, dripping wet and grim-faced. "Zach." "What's happening?" "Creeks overflowed," he explained tersely. "We need to evacuate now. The water's rising fast." To her credit, Nora immediately shifted into action, organizing the children into pairs and instructing the oldest to help the youngest. "Take only what you can carry in your hands," she told them. "Leave everything else." "We can't go out the front," Zach warned, glancing through the window at the rapidly deteriorating conditions. "Water's too deep there already. Is there a back way?" Nora nodded. "Through my office. There's a door that leads to higher ground behind the building." "Good, I'll lead. You follow last to make sure no one falls behind." The evacuation proceeded with remarkable order, given the circumstances. Zach led the children through Nora's small office and out the rear door, where the ground indeed sloped upward away from the creek. The water had not yet reached this side of the building, though muddy rivulets were beginning to form on the hillside. "Stay together," he instructed the wide-eyed students. "We're going to work our way around to where the rest of the town is gathered." As the last child exited the building, Nora paused to grab a wooden box from her desk. "Student records," she explained at Zach's questioning look, "and the school's money box." They had just cleared the building when a tremendous crack split the air. Turning, they watched in horror as part of the creek bank collapsed, sending a new surge of water directly toward the schoolhouse foundation. "Run!" Zach shouted, urging the children up the hillside. They scrambled upward, the older students helping the younger ones navigate the increasingly slippery slope. Zach stayed at the rear with Nora, one hand at her elbow to steady her as they climbed. From this vantage point, they could see the schoolhouse floor beginning to flood as water poured through doors and windows. The carefully arranged desks, the books and slates, the colorful maps Nora had ordered from Chicago, all would be destroyed. "My primer books," she murmured, watching her classroom fill with muddy water, "and the children's artwork." "Things can be replaced," Zach reminded her gently. "You got all the children out safely. That's what matters." She nodded, visibly gathering herself. "Of course, you're right." They continued upward, following the children who had already crested the hill. As they reached the top, they could see the town spread out below, the creek now a raging brown river cutting it nearly in half. On the far side, a crowd had gathered at the highest point, watching anxiously. "There they are," came shouts as the townspeople spotted the rescued children appearing on the hillside. Getting back to the main part of town required a circuitous route, traveling along the ridgeline until they reached a point where the creek narrowed again and could be crossed safely. Throughout the journey, Zach remained at Nora's side, steadying her on difficult passages and ensuring the straggling line of children remained together. When they finally rejoined the town, parents rushed forward to embrace their children, while Mayor Collins approached Zach and Nora with evident relief. "Thank God," he said fervently, "when we couldn't warn you." "Mr. Vaughn reached us in time," Nora assured him, her voice steady despite her bedraggled appearance. "The children are all safe, though I'm afraid the schoolhouse has suffered significant damage." "Buildings can be repaired," Collins echoed Zach's earlier sentiment. "No lives were lost, that's the important thing." As the immediate crisis passed and families began dispersing to check on their properties, Reverend Thomas approached Nora. "My dear, you're soaked through. Please come to the parsonage. My wife will find you dry clothes." Nora glanced at Zachary, still standing protectively near. Their eyes met in shared understanding of what they'd just experienced together. "Thank you," she said softly, meant for him alone. He nodded once, a gesture that conveyed everything words could not: relief at her safety, acknowledgement of their connection, the understanding that something had changed between them yet again. As she walked away with the Reverend, Zach watched her go, no longer able to deny the truth he'd been avoiding since Founders Day. His feelings for Nora Kingsley had progressed far beyond mere acquaintance or even friendship. Against all his defensive instincts, despite his determination to protect himself from further loss, he had begun to care for her in a way he'd believed impossible after Sarah's death. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The flood left its mark on Willow Creek in many ways: damaged buildings, washed-out roads, fields of mud where gardens had been. But for Zachary and Nora, its most significant impact was invisible to others. The shared experience had washed away pretenses, revealing truths neither could continue to ignore. In the days that followed, as the town worked together to repair flood damage, they found themselves repeatedly in each other's company, distributing supplies, helping rebuild fences, temporarily relocating the school to the church while the schoolhouse underwent repairs. Their interactions carried a new awareness, a tacit acknowledgement of feelings neither had yet put into words. Casual touches, his hand steadying her as she navigated muddy streets, her fingers brushing his when passing tools, now lingered slightly longer than necessary. Conversations extended beyond immediate tasks to personal histories, hopes, and observations. When Nora mentioned the difficulty of conducting lessons without proper books, Zach surprised her by appearing at the church the following day with a crate of volumes salvaged from his own home. "They were my mother's," he explained as Nora examined the well-worn copies of Shakespeare, Dickens, and various histories. "She taught school before marrying my father. I thought they might be useful until your new supplies arrive." The gesture touched her deeply, not just the practical help, but the sharing of something personal, a piece of his past offered without reservation. "These are treasures," she said, carefully opening a leather-bound collection of poetry. "Are you certain you want to risk them in a classroom full of children?" His smile held no reservation. "Books should be read, not preserved like museum pieces. My mother would approve." Such moments accumulated, building a foundation of understanding between them that went beyond the town's romantic speculation or their own initial impressions. They discovered shared loves, literature, open spaces, summer thunderstorms, and complementary differences that sparked thoughtful discussions rather than conflict. Yet neither took the final step of declaring their feelings openly. For Zach, the shadow of Sarah's memory still fell across any thought of new beginnings. For Nora, uncertainty about her place in his healing process created caution, until a letter arrived that forced the issue. Nora was sorting through salvaged school materials in the church when Mayor Collins appeared, waving an official-looking envelope. "Excellent news, Miss Kingsley," he announced without preamble. "The Territorial Education Board has approved emergency funds for rebuilding the schoolhouse. They were most impressed by your dedication during the flood." "That is good news," she agreed, accepting the letter he thrust toward her. "The church has been very accommodating, but we really need a proper schoolroom, especially with the increased enrollment." Indeed, Collins nodded enthusiastically. "And there's more. Apparently your former mentor in Boston, Professor Whitfield, wrote quite glowingly about your abilities. The board mentioned a possibility of establishing a regional teacher training program in Helena next year, with you as an instructor." Nora's eyes widened as she skimmed the letter's contents. "I had no idea Professor Whitfield had recommended me for such a position." "Would you consider it?" Collins asked, watching her reaction closely. "It would be a significant advancement in your career, though of course Willow Creek would be devastated to lose you." The question caught her off guard. When she'd accepted the position in Willow Creek, she'd imagined staying for years, perhaps indefinitely. The frontier town had become home more quickly than she'd anticipated, its people woven into the fabric of her daily life. "And Zachary, this is quite unexpected," she said carefully. "The training program wouldn't begin until next spring at the earliest, according to this letter. I'd need time to consider." Collins nodded understandingly. Of course. Just thought you should know of the opportunity. Quite an honor for one so young." After he departed, Nora sat among the scattered school supplies, the letter heavy in her hands. A year ago, such an offer would have represented everything she'd hoped for professionally: recognition, advancement, the chance to influence education throughout the territory. Now, it complicated an already complex emotional landscape. That evening, walking home from the church, she encountered Zachary riding into town. He immediately dismounted when he saw her, leading his horse the remaining distance. "Working late?" he asked, noting the stack of books she carried. "Salvaging what I can," she confirmed. "The new books and supplies won't arrive for weeks yet." They fell into step together, their pace unhurried despite the gathering dusk. Something about his manner seemed different, a resolved quality, as if he'd reached some internal decision. "I was coming to find you, actually," he said after a moment. "I wanted to ask if you'd join me for dinner tomorrow evening." "At the ranch." The invitation startled her with its directness. They had shared meals before, but always in town, always with others nearby. This felt deliberately private, intentionally significant. "I'd like that," she answered simply. He smiled, relief evident in the relaxation of his shoulders. "Good, I'll come for you around 4 if that suits. There's something I'd like to show you before dinner." 4 would be perfect. They had reached the Reverend's house where Nora still boarded. Zachary handed her the books he'd been carrying, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Until tomorrow, then," he said, his voice softening. "Until tomorrow." As she watched him ride away, Nora pressed the territorial board's letter deeper into her pocket. Tomorrow would be time enough to discuss futures and possibilities. Tonight was for anticipation, for the quiet acknowledgement that something important awaited them both. The following afternoon, Zachary arrived precisely at 4, driving a polished buggy rather than riding horseback. He'd taken unusual care with his appearance. Nora noticed immediately, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed, wearing a crisp white shirt under his usual vest. "You look lovely," he said as she approached, his eyes appreciating the simple blue dress she'd chosen. It was one of the few good garments she'd managed to save after the flood. "Thank you, so do you," she replied with a smile, accepting his hand to climb into the buggy. As they drove out of town, conversation flowed easily between them. Updates on flood recovery, amusing anecdotes from her temporary classroom, news of a particularly successful foaling at his ranch. Beneath these everyday topics ran an undercurrent of anticipation, a mutual awareness that this journey represented a crossing of thresholds. "I've never seen the ranch properly," Nora remarked as they followed the winding road northward. "Only glimpsed it from a distance during the community picnic last month." "It's still a work in progress," Zach admitted, "but it's coming along. Another year or two and it will be what Sarah and I envisioned when we first staked our claim." The mention of his late wife came naturally, without the sharp edge of pain that had accompanied her name in earlier conversations. Nora noted the change but made no comment, allowing him to continue at his own pace. The ranch appeared gradually as they crested a low rise, a substantial log house overlooking a valley where cattle grazed on lush summer grass. Outbuildings, corrals, and fenced pastures spoke of careful planning and hard work. A vegetable garden flourished near the house, while young fruit trees formed neat rows along one side. "It's beautiful," Nora said sincerely as they approached. "You've created something remarkable here." Zach's expression softened as he surveyed his domain. "It's taken 4 years to get this far. Started with just a one-room cabin and 10 head of cattle." He helped her down from the buggy in front of the house, but instead of leading her inside, he gestured toward a path that wound behind the main building. "There's something I want to show you first." Curious, Nora followed him along the well-worn track, which led to a gentle slope overlooking a small, sheltered meadow filled with wildflowers. At the meadow's edge stood a sapling oak tree, surrounded by a simple wooden fence. As they drew closer, Nora realized this was a grave site. A carved wooden marker bore the name Sarah Elizabeth Vaughn, along with dates that confirmed her tragically short life. Zachary stood quietly beside the grave, his expression contemplative rather than grief-stricken. After a moment he spoke softly. "I come here often to talk to her. At first it was all anger and despair, raging against the unfairness, the plans we'd never complete. Lately, though, it's been different." He turned to face Nora directly. "I've been telling her about you." The simple statement held such weight that Nora found herself momentarily speechless. This was sacred ground for him, a physical connection to his first love. That he would bring her here, include her in this most personal aspect of his life, spoke volumes about his feelings. Sarah was vibrant, full of life and dreams, he continued, his voice steady. She loved this land, loved building something from nothing. When she died, I thought that part of me died with her, the part that could see beauty and possibility rather than just hardship and loss. He took Nora's hand gently in his. "I was wrong. That capacity wasn't gone, just buried under grief. You helped me remember it exists." "Zach," she began, emotion making her voice unsteady. "I'm not finished," he said softly. "I need to say this completely. For months I've been fighting my feelings for you, believing they somehow dishonored Sarah's memory. But standing here, I finally understood. Loving you doesn't diminish what Sarah and I shared. It honors the man she loved, the man who can still open his heart despite knowing the risks." His hazel eyes held hers, vulnerable yet certain. "I love you, Nora. Not instead of Sarah, not to replace what was lost, but because of who you are and who I am when I'm with you. The declaration, so honestly and eloquently expressed, moved her deeply. For a moment she couldn't speak, overcome by the significance of this moment, not just his declaration, but the setting he'd chosen for it, the inclusion of his past within their potential future. "I love you too," she said finally, the words carrying all the certainty in her heart. "I think I have almost since Founder's Day, though I was afraid to admit it even to myself." His smile bloomed slowly, transforming his features with a joy she hadn't seen before. He lifted a hand to her face, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "There's something else," he said, "something I need to ask you." Before he could continue, Nora remembered the letter still weighing in her pocket. "Wait," she said softly, "there's something you should know first." Briefly, she explained about the territorial board's letter and the potential position in Helena. "I haven't made any decision," she finished. "I wanted to discuss it with you." Rather than looking dismayed, Zachary seemed thoughtful. "It's an impressive opportunity," he acknowledged. "You'd be shaping education for the entire territory." "Yes, but it would mean leaving Willow Creek." "Leaving you," hung unspoken between them. "Not necessarily," he said, surprising her. "Helena's less than a day's journey by train." "If you were based there," he hesitated, then pressed forward. "If you were my wife, living here at the ranch, you could still teach in Helena part of the year. We could make it work." The unexpected proposal, for that's what it was, despite its roundabout delivery, left Nora momentarily stunned. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she managed finally, his expression turned sheepish. "Not how I planned it. I had a whole speech prepared for after dinner." He took both her hands in his. "But yes, Nora Kingsley, I'm asking you to marry me. To share this land and this life. To build something meaningful together, whether that includes teaching in Helena or continuing in Willow Creek or some combination we haven't even imagined yet." Joy bubbled up inside her, bright and effervescent. "Yes," she said simply, "yes to all of it." His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening with shared emotion as she responded eagerly. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, the setting sun had painted the meadow and its flowers in golden light. "I think Sarah would approve," Nora said softly, glancing at the grave site. Zachary nodded, his arm secure around her waist. "I believe she would. She always said life out here required two things, courage and partnership. She'd recognize both in you." As they walked back toward the house, plans and possibilities flowing between them, Nora felt a profound sense of rightness. She had come to the frontier seeking purpose and a fresh start, never imagining she would find both in the heart of a man who had loved and lost, yet found the courage to love again. The town of Willow Creek received news of their engagement with a satisfaction that bordered on smugness. "Didn't we say so all along, Mrs. Hollister commented to anyone who would listen. Ever since Founder's Day, it was clear as crystal where things were heading. Mayor Collins immediately proposed using the newly rebuilt schoolhouse for the wedding ceremony, since it could accommodate more guests than the church. Mrs. Miller organized a quilting circle to create a wedding gift, while Mr. Peterson quietly ordered special items from his suppliers in Helena. Reverend Thomas, watching the community rally around the young couple, remarked to his wife, "It's as if they're claiming partial credit for the match." "Let them," she replied wisely. "It gives everyone a stake in the happiness of two people this town has come to cherish." For Nora and Zachary, the weeks leading to their September wedding passed in a blur of preparations, both for their marriage and for Nora's expanded professional role. The territorial board, delighted by her acceptance of their offer, arranged for her to travel to Helena for a week of planning meetings, with Zachary accompanying her to meet with cattle buyers. A working honeymoon, he teased as they boarded the train together, newly married and facing their future with shared purpose. "The first of many adventures," she replied, her green eyes bright with promise. And as the train carried them eastward, Willow Creek faded temporarily from view but not from their hearts. The frontier town that had witnessed their healing, their connection, and ultimately their love. Back in Willow Creek, the story of the widowed cowboy and the schoolteacher became part of local lore. how grief gave way to hope, how two different worlds merged to create something stronger than either alone, how love could flourish even in the harsh realities of frontier life. It was a story the townspeople never tired of telling, embellishing slightly with each retelling until it achieved the status of legend. A reminder that even in the wild Montana territory, where survival often seemed the only goal worth pursuing, the human heart's capacity for renewal remained the greatest frontier of all.